Although commemoration of the Mayflower quadricentennial has been pretty much suppressed by the COVID pandemic, the anniversary still warrants local recognition. And I've written a couple of books that are not recapitulations of the time-honored Mayflower history. Predictably, several other authors have done so, but deal with how the Pilgrims have been conceptualized and the wide-reaching influence that their story has had on American culture. Now here in Duxbury, the Duxbury Our Pilgrim Story collection of essays covers similar ground in a highly effective and accessible manner, but there was no similar publication planned for Plymouth for the 400th. Now the larger of the two works, Made in America, The Pilgrim Story and How It Grew, was published by the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. It's a collection of topical essays dealing with the many cultural domains through which the Pilgrims have been represented. The other book, Plymouth Rock's Own Story, published by the Pilgrim Society, is a detailed history of the famous boulder, its iconic triumphs and physical tribulations over the past 4 centuries. And before I tell you something about the contents of the book, I should note that there are few references to John and Priscilla, Miles, and none to the Alden House. I've covered that side of the story in other publications that you'll find here in the gift shop. Now, the first book, Made in America. Now, Plymouth Plantation's founder, Harry Hornblower II, once observed that the difficulty of the Pilgrim's story is that there are really 2 stories, a true historical one and a romantic one. The former is a documentary account of the historical Plymouth colonists. The second is a cultural construct of a group known to us as the Pilgrims, which gave meaning to the colonists' enterprise. Now we find the legitimate history of Plymouth colonists in Bradford's Chronicles, Winslow's publications, the Plymouth colonial records, and discoveries from surviving artifacts and architectural surveys. On the other hand, the inspirational message of the Pilgrims, if not directly derived from the historical chronicle, drew on the same history to establish the cultural significance of the Mayflower colonists beyond the mere fact of their historical existence. What I have attempted in Made in America is to investigate how the 2 contrasting strands of Plymouth history, the actual annals of the colony and the legendary Pilgrim story in which the colonists are apotheosized as America's progenitors, became so very ubiquitous an aspect of our national cultural heritage. Now, without the Pilgrims, the Thanksgiving holiday would be unrecognizable, and there would be no Plymouth Rock, Pilgrim Hall, or Plymouth Plantation. Stories and myths of the landing on the rock, the 5 kernels of the parched corn, the romantic triangle of John Alden, Priscilla Mullins, and Miles Standish, and the first Thanksgiving, if absent from the primary sources, have had too strong an influence to be ignored or casually discarded. Now, they're expressions of the values and traditions that defined American society over the past 2 centuries. Every society needs to develop narratives that give meaning and agency to the bare facts of history. New national myths are evolving even now, but we need to appreciate the roles of the historic Pilgrim story to better understand the culture we are still living in today. Now, the Pilgrims are arguably one of America's premier patriotic symbols. Each November, their universally recognizable images can be seen across the nation as the incarnation of a particularly American holiday, Thanksgiving. Generations of American school children have been introduced to these images each fall as cutouts and illustrations, while the familiar steeple-hatted, dark-cloaked, and generously bebuckled figures appear on cards, table decorations, and in seasonal advertising. The Pilgrim story being both textual and visual, it's appropriate that Made in America is liberally illustrated. Each year, the old tales are recalled to mind, exemplifying strength and faith, courage in the face of adversity, the Mayflower's dramatic voyage, that terrible first winter, and finally the glorious perseverance and survival celebrated by the Pilgrims and their supportive Indian allies at what we call the first Thanksgiving. Now, the classic legacy of the Pilgrims was first defined at the close of the 18th century. Their epic shaped a powerful and pervasive popular tradition, a distinctive genre in American folklore called the Pilgrim story. And by the mid-20th century, the Pilgrim story was so well established in popular culture that most Americans felt they knew what these men and women looked like, what the events in their lives meant, and how they would have lived. And through these well-known narratives, the Pilgrims played a larger role in our patriotic civil religion than they did in actual history. Now, the real Plymouth colonists were ordinary people who played a small but virtuous part in the history and left few tangible remains behind. It is not their accomplishments that have proved so potent and persistent of effect on subsequent generations. It is their inspirational influence that brings the past forward to the present. It is in this sense that their story has meaning for anyone who is trying to understand what this country is all about. The Pilgrim's image was first invoked as a symbol of the establishment of a new American nation, an invented tradition to provide meaning and legitimacy for that unprecedented enterprise. The Pilgrims became the spiritual ancestors of all Americans, in Morrison's apt phrase, before the old hegemony began to break down in the 20th century. They are evoked to sustain the usness of the past against the otherness of the future. And they became the basis of children's stories as well as Thanksgiving holiday symbols, and took their place besides George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Uncle Sam as representations of America for all the world to see. History may or may not always reveal the past to the extent scholars would like, but it can and should provide meaning to our lives. Now, Made in America, the Pilgrim story and how it grew, is not an exercise in debunking, which commonly involves disparaging and fault-finding rather than constructive criticism, and usually commits as many, if not more, errors and misunderstandings than the original. Now, I've chosen a number of topics pertinent to the Pilgrim story and sought out their origins and evolution to explain how these components of the story came to be and whether they're mythic or historical. And we begin with the basic question of why the Pilgrims are given preferential treatment in the popular account of American history. The Plymouth colony story has been Americans' primary ideological or origin-explaining narrative for hundreds of years. For almost all as long, there have been incredulous critics asking why. Why should the Pilgrims get all the credit when they weren't the first European colonists to settle or even having Thanksgiving services in what's now the United States of America? Why should Plymouth be held in such esteem when the colony was never an economic, cultural, or political powerhouse and ceased to exist independently as early as 1692? Why should a single national narrative be so desirable in the first place? And why should Plymouth Rock be more iconic than Ellis Island? And lastly, why should this or any colonial incursion be glorified over the indigenous population that was overwhelmed beneath the waves of American and European occupation? Why indeed? Well, next we survey the way in which the Pilgrims were introduced in both popular and official history before their final major commemoration in 1820. A simple, straightforward progression from the actual historical data in their eventual elevation as America's honored progenitors and exemplars is traced. The initial development of the Pilgrim story can be divided into three parts. Plymouth colony's history was configured as the first phase of New England's providential history, with a focus on religion and God's plan for America. Puritan New England's origins in Plymouth were reinterpreted as a legitimization for both political and religious independence at the time of the American Revolution. And colonial history was politicized as the Pilgrims became differentiated from Puritans and New England's Puritans and Virginia's Cavaliers vied for symbolic superiority as regional myths of the origin of the United States. Now, having introduced the story itself, we move on to specific recurring questions, such as, when did the Plymouth colonists actually receive the name and title the Pilgrims? The usage didn't originate in Plymouth, where the Mayflower colonists were known locally as the forefathers until about 1800, but in Boston. 1798, a group of conservative Federalists called the Sons of the Pilgrims gathered to celebrate Forefathers' Day, the Plymouth commemoration of the 1620 landing on December 22nd, at a suggestion of the historian Reverend Jeremy Belknap. Another perennial matter of concern has been the matter of faith and pride amongst descendants in the division between Pilgrims and Puritans. Now, this differentiation was intended to present them as a more sympathetic than their dour neighbors in Massachusetts Bay. It has long been a matter of conviction amongst Pilgrims advocates that the Plymouth separatists was not, certainly not, Puritans. Inevitably, the reality behind this belief is more complex and far less black and white than the popular binary opposition allows for. A more sympathetic topic is the discussion of the origin and meaning behind the stereotypical black clothes, buckles, and blunderbusses. It's regularly and earnestly asserted at gatherings of the Pilgrim descendants, we know they wore colorful clothes, not those black costumes and buckles that people think they wore. Now, this is usually uttered in tones of incredulity, the continuing ignorance of the general public on one hand, and that is a recent discovery on the other. Well, the odd thing is that the assumption of new knowledge has been expressed for decades, if not longer, and the revelation never gets old. The belief that the Pilgrims first adopted and then rejected communism, a theme enthusiastically embraced by conservative writers, is a historical misunderstanding. The shift from collective to individualized labor in 1623 is one of the most politically charged narratives to come out of the Pilgrim story. The problem is that the colonists didn't adopt communism or collectivism voluntarily or through some misguided idealism, but rather had it imposed upon them in the form of contractual obligations that had first been introduced under the English government's policies for chartered commercial corporations and monopolies. And they were never fully approved of it in the first place. The Story of Plymouth Rock, a shorter version of my Pilgrim Society publication on the same topic, presents an overview of the myths, facts, and conjectures surrounding the celebrated boulder. Similarly, a review of the relationship with our two Pilgrim holy days, Forefathers' Day and Thanksgiving, and their respective development discuss how the celebrations are instrumental in popularizing the Pilgrim story. Now, is the Pilgrim story about a people without faults or error? No example of human history can exhibit that. In these times of cultural wars and social divisions, the Pilgrims, like other American exemplars, are subjected to the contemporary furor for seeking out every purported instance of oppression, treachery, and tragedy in our history. Self-righteous zealots demand the repudiation of venerated individuals or groups that don't meet their uncompromising modern standards of virtue. Well, it's quite true. The Pilgrims' interaction with the native peoples, for example, the eventual results certainly overshadowed the promise of the first Thanksgiving and the alliance with Massasoit. However, these critics commonly depreciate every positive element in the story and revile them as deep-dyed villains. Now, if the Pilgrims were once represented in too laudatory a manner, the effort to vilify them is even more false a portrayal. And there is not time to discuss all the topics, but in short, there is also a chronology of Pilgrim commemorations from 1820 to 1995, an audit of Pilgrim monuments and memorials in America and Europe, and reviews of how the Pilgrims have been represented in fine art, caricature, fiction, music, commercial branding, and souvenirs. The text scrutinized the famous courtship, well, how the Pilgrims have been presented in schools, the history of Pilgrim Hall and Plymouth Plantation, and what the Wampanoag settlement at Patuxet, or Accomac, or Ampom, they used all three names, was like in 1620. The final chapter, Miscellaneous Myths and Misconceptions, briefly treats 22 other themes, such as myths rejected or current, concerning log cabins, the Mayflower being a slave ship, Miles Standish as a Catholic, the 5 kernels of corn, the printing press screw, or Priscilla being a Huguenot, and debatable topics such as the confusion about the merchant adventurers with the Council of New England concerning their patents, the true significance of the Mayflower Compact, and the question of religious liberty. The aim is to assiduously scrutinize the Pilgrim story, the corpus of myths, legends, and yes, truths that grew up around the history of the Mayflower voyage and the settlement of Plymouth Plantation. We hope to spur the readers into taking a more nuanced view of what has been taken for granted about the Pilgrims. And in this, we followed in the footsteps of other efforts to demystify and correct the popular understanding of our Pilgrim ancestors or predecessors, as the case may be. It's my hope that Made in America will assist readers in gaining a clearer understanding of how complex the Pilgrim story actually is, rather than just the sum of commonly received impressions from textbooks and popular media. The second book I'm talking about focuses on the premier Pilgrim icon, Plymouth Rock, and how a simple glacial erratic boulder became the symbol of the entire Pilgrim adventure. It's called Plymouth Rock's Own Story. Now, Plymouth Rock, much to look at. In fact, it's become a traditional for visitors to be, or at least pretend to be, disappointed when they first look down at the roughly 7 by 5 foot granite boulder beneath the far more imposing memorial portico. And while the tangible rock may be unimpressive, the historical narrative it embodies has long been a preeminent factor in the chronicle of our nation's origin. Although Little Plymouth Colony lost its independent existence when it was swallowed up by Massachusetts Bay in 1692, it was generally agreed that the Pilgrim settlement was in fact the genesis of Puritan New England altogether, a judgment attested to by the earliest regional historians from Nathaniel Morton in 1669 to Thomas Hutchinson in 1764. The series of factors conspired to elect December 11th, 1620, old style, at landing at Wampanoag, Patuxet. The first occurred in 1741 when Plymouth's Reverend Elder and civic leader, 95-year-old Thomas Faunce, identified the isolated boulder we now know as Plymouth Rock as the landing place of the Mayflower Shallop on that December Monday. The next was the establishment in 1769 of the Old Colony Club, of the annual observance of the anniversary of the landing as Forefathers' Day on December 22nd. Now, the reason for the change in dates is the change in calendar that occurred in this area in 1752. The third and possibly determinative incident was when, roused by patriotic fervor against acts by the British Crown, Plymouthans selected Forefathers Rock as a symbol of their own town's independent origins. They chose to remove the top half of the boulder from the waterfront and unite it with another patriotic emblem, a liberty pole, erected in Town Square. Now, an account of the rock's physical circumstances would be given with a fair level of accuracy. Plymouth historian Dr. James Thatcher tells us in 1774, the inhabitants of the town, animated by a glorious spirit of liberty which pervaded the province, and mindful of the precious relic of our forefathers, resolved to consecrate the rock on which they landed as a shrine of liberty. Colonel Theophilus Cotton and a large number of inhabitants assembled with about 30 yoke of oxen for the purpose of its removal. The rock was elevated from its bed by a means of large screws, and in attempting to mount it on the carriage, it split asunder without any violence. And as no one had noticed the flaw, the circumstances occasioned some surprise, It is not strange that some of the patriots of the day should be disposed to indulge a little in superstition when in favor of their good cause. The upper portion, weighing many tons, was conveyed to the Liberty Pole Square in front of the meeting house, where, we believe, waved over it the flag of the far-famed motto, Liberty or Death. Well, Plymouth Rock remained in Town Square for 50 years. In being thus accessible to anyone interested in taking a hammer to it, the rock was pilfered for highly desirable relics, as de Tocqueville famously observed. The rock has become an object of veneration in the United States. I've seen bits of it carefully preserved in several towns of the Union. Does this not sufficiently show that all human power and greatness is in the soul of man? Here is a stone which the feet of a few outcasts pressed for an instant, and the stone has become famous. It is treasured by a great nation. Its very dust shed is a relic. But what has become of the doorsteps of 1,000 palaces? Who troubles himself about them? So on July 4th, 1834, the town moved the rock to Pilgrim Hall to prevent further depredation, when a protective iron fence was erected around it and 1620 painted on the face. At the time of the third move in 1880, a Mr. F.B. Cobb, who had transported the rock in 1834 using 4 yoke of oxen and a horse, noted that it was in one piece, but many years ago divided again by the action of frost. On September 27, 1880, Plymouth Rock's sections were quietly reunited beneath a granite canopy completed in 1867, designed by Hammett Billings of Boston, who also devised Plymouth's 81-foot granite forefathers monument. The rock was finally returned to its resting place at sea level under the new Colonial Dame's portico on June 21, 1921. And there were a number of other questions to be asked. For example, how did Plymouth Rock get here and where did it come from? Well, apparently it was carried here by the massive Laurentide ice sheet some 20,000 years ago. What's the rock made of? Well, it's a variety of granite, or granodorite, an igneous or volcanic rock that's mostly comprised of 3 minerals, quartz, feldspar, and mica. This particular stone is known as Dedham granite from the typical outcrops found in that town. And was the rock originally much larger? It's been occasionally asserted that Plymouth Rock was once much larger, even 3 times its current magnitude. There does not seem to be any reliable evidence for this. What about all the fragments that are broken off the rock? Well, aside from one 400-pound piece that ended up at the Harlow House, and the remainder of which is now in Pilgrim Hall, no other sizable chunk is recorded to have existed. Most of the souvenir pieces were quite small, only a few inches in diameter, and sold for like $25 at the Pilgrim Society. Plymouth Rock has been invoked by innumerable orators and educators over the past 2 centuries as a metonym for the history of the Pilgrims, a tangible icon that stood for what Plymouth Colony contributed to the development of the United States. The Pilgrims' religious virtue and their non-threatening political integrity strengthened their candidacy as America's best historical exemplars rather than the Jamestown colonists. As Samuel Eliot Morison, with quiet elegance, said, "Thus the Pilgrims have become, in a sense, the spiritual ancestors of all Americans, whatever their stock, race, or creed." Now, despite the loyal devotion of generations of New Englanders, the authenticity of the 1620 landing of the rock has always been controversial. The principal difficulty is that there are no contemporary mentions of the rock in the primary sources, Mort's relation or Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. Instead, the landing narrative depends on a chain of oral testimony from Elder Thomas Fonts in 1741 to Deacon Ephraim Spunner and Mrs. Joanna Howland White. Now, did the Mayflower Shallop crew actually land on or near the rock? Who first stepped on the rock? Mary Chilton or John Alden? Neither are there because they were not aboard the Shallop at that time. And despite the unavoidable gaps in the historical record and inevitable differences in cultural perception, the evidence that does exist can be surveyed. The original landing accounts neither confirm nor deny the rock event. And was Elder Fonce's testimony reliable? Well, Fonce's original remarks on the Plymouth story were belatedly recorded in Thatcher's History of Plymouth in 1832. About the year in 1741, Elder Fonce pointed out the rock directly under the bank of Coles Hill, which his father had assured him was that which had received the footsteps of their fathers on their first arrival, and which should be perpetuated to posterity. Well, as neither he nor his father are eyewitnesses, it's often dismissed as just hearsay or invention. However, Fonce has ample opportunity to hear the story from those who had been there in 1620. Thomas Fonce, born in 1647, was 10 years old when Governor Bradford died in 1657, 26 years old when John Howland died in 1673, 33 years old when George Soule died in 1680, and 40 years old when John Alden died in 1687. The landing narrative is at least possibly true. Now, would the crew of the Mayflower Shallop want to avoid scraping their craft on a rock? Well, this common sense objection ignores the difference between bringing a shallow draft longboat to land on Plymouth's shelving shore and the problem of disembarking from a shallop with a draft of 18 inches and much additional freeboard. They had enough of that diving in the water in December when they're waiting at Cape Cod. Modern critics justified in dismissing the Plymouth Rock tradition as either a myth or more pejoratively as lies. Well, dismissing Fonce's evidence outright is often just an attempt to simplify an intractable question, or to desire to be fashionably disdainful of Yankee oral tradition, Native American traditions being received quite differently, rather than really an impartial effort at historical judgment. And labeling Plymouth Rock as an intentional lie, however, is simply rhetorical vilification. Every society has its own symbolic economy, in which certain objects, images, and ideas are invested with an aura of veneration and respect, whether religious or patriotic, quite independent of their mundane characteristics. They are examples of poetic truth that inspire a level of emotional commitment and cultural ideas that blunt historical facts simply cannot accomplish. Now, Plymouth Rock is one of these, as are the American flag, Statue of Liberty, or the Statue of Blind Justice. Over time, the landing has become a mythological narrative, a founding legend of the new United States. The 1620 landing, rightfully or not, came to represent the conception of a nation that was born in 1776. Whether the ultimate historical truth, and whatever it might have been, having a town, a region, and by extension, an entire nation founded on a rock, is no bad thing. Thank you.